Sponsored by Sinclair Heating and Cooling for 24/7 comfort on call.
Hello, Brad.
Greetings, Chris.
Got some aches and pains there, do we?
For years. They're becoming additive. Today we're going to talk about glucosamine. It's an over-the-counter supplement that many doctors even recommend, and millions of Americans use it. I've been using it since 2014. It supposedly helps joints, and there's actually been a fair amount of research that confirms it does help minimize joint pain.
Okay.
And that's why this story is so much attention-grabbing and a little alarming. Millions take this joint supplement, but scientists found a concerning Alzheimer's link. This was a breaking story last week. It comes from the University of Florida Health. So let's find out a little bit more about the study. They used artificial intelligence to analyze University of Florida Health medical records collected over a 12-year period from 2012 to 2024. They focused on patients who were already diagnosed with either Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, also known as ADRD, or mild cognitive impairment. So they really only looked at people who already had something going on with their brain. So I don't want to mislead you to think that everybody might be a problem if you're taking glucosamine, okay? But here's what they found. They found that the glucosamine use was actually common in both groups, about 1,900 patients with ADRD and about 2,700 patients with MCI reported taking the supplement. It represented about 8% of each group. So here's what they found. After accounting for factors such as age, sex, and demographic differences, they found that glucosamine use was associated with a 25% greater likelihood of progressing from mild cognitive impairment to dementia. And additionally, in patients already diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, glucosamine was associated with a 25% increase in likelihood of death by any cause. Both of these findings are pretty alarming.
Those are pretty big numbers.
Okay. They also say no similar increase was observed in the MCI group, suggesting that the supplement's effects may be more pronounced once dementia is established. So again, that's probably the big key here, okay? So here's what they think is going on. The glucosamine is a naturally occurring sugar-related molecule that can easily enter the brain. Once there, the body builds some sort of complex starch structures on these proteins in your brains, the same kind of proteins associated, okay, becoming overactive. It actually makes those proteins become even more active and contributing to the progression of Alzheimer's. So here's what they say, by the way, and this is important. Obviously, while it's an association and not proof, it does raise an important clinical question that now deserves much more attention. But again, I want to emphasize that this was in patients who already had some sort of cognitive decline of some sorts or Alzheimer's, not in just everybody on the street.
Which oftentimes is in older folks, and older folks have joint stuff, so maybe they turn to glucosamine. Could be a chicken or the egg thing going on here, but
I think so.
More study for sure. Brad, thanks so much.
You bet.
Good to see you. See you tomorrow.